Good afternoon. I introduce our guest, the Reverend Doug Asbury, a member of the Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network. Reverend Asbury is the convener of that group's Christian caucus. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Earl. It's great to be with you and your colleagues.
Tell me, Doug, what about Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network motivated you to join it?
Well, I met two Korean scholars up at Northwestern University about 20 years ago, and one of them was a scholar in international relations, and he's now a professor of international relations at a university in Seoul, South Korea. I edited both of their dissertations for English language, and in editing not only his dissertation, but also subsequent journal articles that he submitted, which he writes a lot on Korea's relationship, South Korea's relationship with the United States, with China, with North Korea, with other Asian countries and Asia Pacific countries. I have become aware of much more of Korea's history, and especially its history in its mutual defense alliance with the United States. And part of what has concerned me in that regard is that South Korea has had a booming economy for the past 40 years or so, and yet it seems still to be, in some sense, subservient to US foreign policy, so that when the US targets another country as an enemy, South Korea seems to need to follow in its footsteps. That has hindered the ending of the Korean War on a formal basis by a full peace treaty, because the Korean War is still under the condition of armistice, which is simply a ceasefire, and it's been that way since 1953. When I heard about the Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network that is doing some things, taking concrete steps to try to end that war, it really appealed to me because I'm concerned about my friend in South Korea not having his home blown up in Seoul or his family killed by a conflict that's unnecessary between North Korea and South Korea. So this gave me a way to address my concerns about them personally, but also my concern about the United States foreign policy and the well-being of Koreans on the whole peninsula.
Thank you. Now, you have the Christian caucus. What does our calling as Christians add to our peacemaking efforts beyond the general desire for peace in Korea, which, of course, our non-Christian partners share?
Yeah. And sometimes they're more effective in their work than we Christians are. But we have a real challenge. I've always lamented the fact on some level that we serve a God whose son told us that we have to die to ourselves, that we have to sacrifice even our own lives for the sake of the mission that Christ came to serve in the world. That calls us to vulnerability, which is a frightening thing when we have a world that's so filled with violence. Nevertheless, that's our calling. Much of Congress is actually Christian. About 88% of Congress claims to be Christian. And so if we as Christians are called to bring peace to the world, to love our neighbor, to love even our enemy, when we become Congress people, we must have a terrible conflict between our Christian commitments and our commitments to our country. What we don't see often in Congress is that people become aware that if we had peace in the world and followed actually the peacemaking that Christ calls us to, even with enemies, that actually we wouldn't need the arms buildup that causes our country to have the largest military budget of any country in the world, and even larger than the next 4 or 5 countries combined. And so this call to bring peace through loving our neighbor and loving our enemy is a particular calling that we Christians have that ought to inspire us, even ought to inspire our congressional representatives who are Christian to follow the truth that Christ presented. And I'd like to refer to Martin Luther King Jr.'s comment that hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And we have to figure out, as Christians in the United States of America, what does love look like in international relations? And I would say that it includes justice and it includes trust. And if we can build trust and justice, even with North Korea, they will be persuaded, at least the likelihood that they'll be persuaded to trust us and to have just relationships with us and with South Korea will be increased enormously. So that's a challenge that we have to face.
Thank you. Now, what are some of the special things that Christian peacemakers might do to promote peace in Korea?
Yeah, this is something that I didn't know until I joined Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network. There are actually bills that are presented to the 116th Congress, which was the one that passed 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and the 117th Congress. One of them, now in both houses of Congress, calls on the president to commit serious efforts to signing a peace treaty with North Korea. So it would be the United States, North Korea, and South Korea, and perhaps China also. If we could sign a peace treaty with North Korea, that would be a step of saying, the United States does not wish you ill will. We do not want to threaten you anymore, even with our nuclear arsenal. We wish you well, and we want to have peaceable relationships develop with you so that both of our countries and all of our countries that would be part of the peace agreement would be able to experience prosperity in a peaceable relationship. So these two bills, if we can get enough co-sponsors, would pass through Congress and tell President Biden, now our president, we want you to commit serious efforts to signing this peace treaty with North Korea, South Korea, perhaps China. There are two other bills, one of them that calls for the restoration of humanitarian aid to North Korea, which many agencies were providing to North Korea up until the Trump administration ended that possibility in 2017. A similar bill in the other House of Congress calls for the restoration of visits between South Koreans and Korean Americans who have family members that they know of in North Korea. These two bills would provide a great deal of trust building in our relationship with North Korea to say, we don't wish you ill because we have family members in North Korea, and we would not want harm to come to them as a result of anything our countries would do to you. We also want to provide as much humanitarian aid as you need that you can't provide for yourself. If we could persuade through those acts of kindness and care that North Korea is much more likely to say, oh, maybe they don't wish us ill. Maybe we can begin to trust them and work out a relationship of peace with them, both South Korea and the United States.
Thank you very much, Doug. We appreciate your coming and sharing with us this afternoon.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Earl.